Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st. And if you can see in the notes below, the classes from the previous week are in our past class sessions folder, which you can find at the top of our Moodle page. So basically, what you've got on our home Moodle page is the current week. And for this week, at least for this class, we're talking about 3 more chapters from the textbook: understanding, audience analysis, and generating ideas. And you've probably also seen that I've responded to your first discussion forum response where I asked you to introduce yourself to the class. So I wanted to introduce myself to the class very briefly before I get into the specifics of today's class. So I was born and raised in New York City, and I attended college in upstate New York. I attended the University of Rochester, where they advertised themselves as a place where students could experience, quote, real winters, unquote, which sounded very romantic to me until I actually attended that school and realized that it just meant intense snowfall. But nevertheless, there I was, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, because I was absolutely positively certain I was going to be a lawyer, which goes to show how your career plans can change as your education progresses. In part because I took a Shakespeare class that really changed everything. And I realized that what I wanted to do was not become a lawyer. I really wanted to focus on Shakespeare and his contemporaries and teach. So instead of going to law school, I attended graduate school for English literature in a warm climate, though. I'd had enough of those real winters, and I chose UCLA in Southern California. And while they don't have winters, they have other weather challenges. So, drought and earthquake are just a few of them. But nevertheless, there I was, majoring in English. And what I realized is that I started to miss winter after all. So, after I had finished my degree and I started teaching, I began applying to positions anywhere on the East Coast, as far as I was concerned, would be home. And I settled on a little community I had never heard of before. And they asked me for an interview, this place called Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So you know how my story ends. And I came out for an interview in 1993. It's hard to believe so many years have gone by. Very hot summer day. And we talked a little bit about what my transition might be like because I had been in Southern California for so many years at this point, and I hadn't experienced a winter for a while, but I certainly had experienced winters in college and also just growing up in New York City. So I should be fine. And I was assured that the winters here in Massachusetts are, quote, not that bad, unquote. And if you'll remember the year I started, 1993, which was a historical year because it was one of the worst winters on record. In fact, we broke records for snowfall and for cold. I was completely unprepared. Everybody was, but I in particular was unprepared. But I stayed, and I've basically gone through all kinds of weather changes since. So I do teach mostly English classes, but also teach communications classes, also teach personal communications such as public speaking. And yes, I'm the one who teaches the horror film class. So I've got lots of eclectic interests, as you can see. So today, what I wanted to talk about was public speaking, one of my many interests. And chapter 4, at least in the newest edition of the textbook, talks about the importance of listening. And I know that everybody usually is focused on the idea of delivering a speech. Your first speech will be coming up on Thursday, the 30th, where you have 5 minutes to give an autobiographical speech where you are basically telling your audience, which happens to be your classmates, a little bit about yourself. Perhaps you want to do a life overview. Obviously, you're going to have to pick and choose because you've got only 5 minutes. Perhaps what you might want to do is focus on a particular time period or element of your life. If you're not necessarily sure what to talk about, you could always talk about education as the one thing that we all share, whether it be your educational past, or it could be your goals for the future, or your educational present. How and why did you end up in this particular course in this particular time? But in addition to giving a speech, you are going to be listening to the speeches of your classmates. And that means that you want to develop your listening skills as well as your public speaking skills. And I could tell you that people are notoriously poor listeners. There is a difference between hearing, which is processing sound, what most people can do, but it's fairly passive because you can process sound but not necessarily be paying attention. Listening is when you're paying attention, when you're understanding, and it's quite active. So if you are taking notes, for instance, one of the things you can do, it's known as RRA, is review, relate, anticipate. It's one of the ways that you can focus for listening. There are a lot of reasons why people are poor listeners. There are lots of barriers to listening. Something that's known as the internal perceptual field, you might know of as daydreaming. Same thing, basically that we think much more quickly than people can speak, and before you know it, we begin to allow our thoughts to drift, and one thought leads to another. There also is an external perceptual field, and that's the environment. Things like noise, for instance, or temperature. Sometimes you can accommodate for that as a speaker, and sometimes you can't. And there also are such things as trigger words, words that can evoke strong emotional responses so that a person begins to think about their emotional response and is no longer listening to what it is you're saying. So there are different kinds of listening, and I suggest that we are going to be utilizing all of them over the course of this semester. There's appreciative listening when you listen for entertainment, and I think the first speech is quite entertaining. I think it's fascinating to hear about the members of the class. Discriminative listening is when you are listening for presentation and watching for presentation. We're going to be talking about the presentation of speeches very soon. And there is listening with empathy. Empathic listening is oftentimes viewed as the kind of listening that's done by therapists. It's emotionally supportive listening. And we do want to be emotionally supportive of one another in this workshop class where we are developing our listening skills. Listening for comprehension, which is what I suspect you're doing right now, where you're trying to listen for information. Critical listening, questioning, analyzing, interpreting. The questions that you can ask yourself when you're listening to speeches could be questions that are on the speech rating handout in our syllabus and other documents section of the class. And this is a template that I'm going to be using for evaluating your first speech. So this will also be helpful for you in terms of pulling together your speech. I use the template only for the first speech. For the second and third speeches, I just take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But if you were to look at the template, you can see that it's divided into two pieces. One is for content and another is for presentation. And I had asked you to watch the Toastmasters video last class, so this should sound familiar, that you've got an introduction, a body or a discussion section, and a conclusion for the content. And thinking about things like, do you get your audience's attention at the beginning of the speech? Which could just be as simple as saying hello and introducing yourself. Then do you have a transition for a preview statement? You can see on our template, there's a ranking there from none, needs improvement, good, or excellent. And then we get to the body of the speech, which is where you've got your evidence and your details. Is there a clear pattern? Are your main points stated? Are you developing those points? Do you have any kind of voice mannerisms, the ums, the ahs, the filler words that people will oftentimes use? And do you have well-chosen words? And again, we rank that from poor, needs improvement, good, and excellent. And then a conclusion where hopefully you've got some sort of restatement or some sort of summary to lead us into the concluding statement, which is where you say farewell, in effect, to your audience. And then we've got delivery. Things like eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, articulation, and enthusiasm. These are all things we will be talking about over the next few classes. Eye contact, this is where you will be focusing on the camera because this is what your audience will be seeing when they watch your videos. Body movement, you need to make decisions as to how it is you're going to film yourself. You don't necessarily have to do a full body shot. You can see I'm not doing that necessarily, but you also want to make sure that you've got some movement in your face in particular because people will be evaluating your face and you want to make sure that's very visible. Vocal quality, things like volume, we want to be able to hear you. Articulation, how well are you forming your words? And of course, enthusiasm, because if you don't appear enthusiastic, why should we? Again, the same ranking of poor, needs improvement, good, and excellent. Now, the next chapter that I had assigned for today, audience analysis, and this is a discipline in and of itself. We talked a little bit, I believe, about culture, which is any kind of group membership. And basically, in terms of culture, there is a predictive element to it. So you can predict, at least in part, behaviors, which are actions and are very visible, attitudes, which are feelings, beliefs, things that are true or false, and values, which include all of the above, and values can be highly resistant to change. This will be particularly important when we get to our third speech, the persuasive speech, where the goal isn't necessarily to have everybody agree with you. That's an impossibility. The goal is to earn everybody else's respect. So last class we talked about things like ethos or ethics, and that's one of the ways to earn an audience's respect, is to be ethical. And in terms of behaviors, that can include conversational styles. So, if you're aware of some people who tend to be more long winded than others, and oftentimes that is individual, but it also can be determined by culture. So, in Western cultures, for instance, the United States, it's less common to be long winded, it's more common to be succinct and to the point, where you've got other cultures, let's say Asian cultures, where storytelling is an important element in terms of distributing information. Again, you want to be careful though with trying to predict anything based on culture or group membership because there is always individual variance and you want to avoid stereotyping. But the idea is that that group begins to form a kind of personality. It begins to have some sort of cohesive element. And we usually think of culture in very broad terms, things like age, for instance, or ethnicity. But it can be very specialized. For better or for worse, this class is a culture. It's a group that begins to form its own personality. So that said, expect many different kinds of cultures in your audience because of demographics, the observable characteristics of individuals. And yes, they're the biggies like age and gender and ethnic background and education, political affiliation, religion. But it can also be very specialized, such as pug lovers, which happens to be one of my cultures. I've got a pug. And let me tell you that pug owners or people who are owned by pugs might be a little bit more accurate. We are indeed a unique group with certain behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and values. So when you talk about audience segmentation, you're dividing your audience into all the different demographic groups. It's something that oftentimes happens with advertising when you're trying to promote product to a particular group. And one of the things you can do is psychological profiling. And I minored in psychology in college, but psychology is an inexact science. So there is always, room for interpretation. But basically, when you are psychologically profiling a culture, you're looking at their beliefs, their attitudes, their values, and trying to get a sense as to what might be true of the majority of the group, or at least a large portion of the group. Now, the text also talks about hostile audiences. It's unlikely that you will encounter something like this. Perhaps a skeptical audience, usually people who encounter or speakers who encounter hostile audiences, they do so because they are quite aware that they are entering into a situation where there could be hostility. Think about something like giving a speech to a different political party. But many of the techniques for dealing with that situation can also be techniques used with a skeptical audience, which could be the case, let's say, for something like a persuasive speech. So there is no magic bullet, unfortunately, but establishing goodwill is usually a good way to begin. Establishing areas of agreement. So usually we focus on the things that we don't agree with, but we can focus on at least some elements that we agree with. To establish credibility. So sometimes you've already got credibility that's built into your speech. For instance, your autobiographical speech is about you. So you should know your own life. And this speech was deliberately put at the beginning of the speeches that you would deliver because I didn't want you to have to do any outside research. That doesn't preclude you from talking to family or doing some Ellis Island Records review if you so wanted to, but certainly not required. The idea is that you have the information now. Our second speech, the informative speech, I usually recommend for a condensed class, much like a summer class, that you probably want to inform or teach us of something that you already have some knowledge of, because that will save you some time, but not necessarily a requirement if you wanted to go out and learn something new and share it with us. And certainly the idea of credibility might be something that you may need to establish if it's something that you are just learning about, or perhaps you've already got some expertise in it that you can share, that you have some expertise or past experience with this, and that will be an establishing of credibility. And of course, this is something that would carry over into our persuasive speech as well. Using credible outside sources. And we know we live in a brave new world right now, and you're not required to use outside sources until the third and final speech, the persuasive speech. So by that point, we'll talk a little bit about outside sources that you could utilize that perhaps are a little bit less risky, or a little bit less prone to misinformation. Being professional. That goes a long way to earning your audience's respect, which again is what you want to do when you are delivering a speech, is earning respect. Humor. And humor is a wonderful way to diffuse tension. Humor can be basically culturally based. What could be funny to one group may not necessarily be funny for another. So you've got to be careful. Being multi-sided. Instead of what I call ignoring the elephant in the room, the other side of the argument, at least address it, albeit briefly. You don't want to lose control of your speech. But oftentimes, the reason why audiences are skeptical or even downright hostile is because they're never acknowledged. And sometimes that's all they want, is just to be acknowledged that there are other viewpoints and there are other possibilities. And if there are going to be debates, to establish some sort of principles of judgment. The last chapter I had assigned was on generating ideas. So this is where you are now in terms of preparing for your first speech. And you might end up talking about something in your first speech that you could use in your second speech and even in your third speech. So I've had students who have done that. For instance, in the autobiographical speech, they talk about how they are a fan of, let's say, hockey. And then in the second speech, the informative speech, they talk about the history of hockey. And in the third speech, they might argue that we should establish a hockey team at GCC, for instance. But all three speeches can also be independent of one another and have nothing related with one another. But all speeches, you need to select and narrow the topic. So for your first speech, you know what your topic is. It's autobiographical, but what specifically are you going to be talking about? The second is determining the purpose, which you might think is fairly straightforward, that you want to earn a good grade. The purpose of the autobiographical speech for me is twofold. The first is so that you can practice some of the elements of speech delivery that we're talking about. And the second is so that we can get to know one another a little bit more as we form a culture in class. Analyzing audience and occasion. I have a bit of a story to tell you that occurred to a colleague of mine teaching at another college. I won't mention the name of the college, but this colleague of mine was teaching a public speaking class and was listening to a speech from a student. It was a very philosophical speech. It was about being true to oneself. And what ended up happening during the course of this speech is that the student began to disrobe. And as it looked like this person was about to take off their pants, the teacher stopped the speech right then and there and asked, what was happening. The student responded that they wanted to show their true selves, that in order to, being true to oneself, the way to do that would be to show themselves without clothing. And that's where the teacher shut down the speech and said that that was not appropriate. Might I suggest that the student didn't analyze the audience nor the occasion? That said, I don't know if there is an audience or an occasion for disrobing, but certainly not in an academic classroom. Gathering material, and again, you're not necessarily going to need to do this until the final speech. Making a speaking outline. This is going to be particularly important. We are going to be talking about outlines because the idea behind an outline is that it helps you formulate your speech. And that I think of it as almost like the safety net a trapeze artist would use, in that a good trapeze artist doesn't fall into the net, but it would be foolhardy to perform without a net just in case. Same with the speaking outline. You have to have a speaking outline for your speech. I have speaking outlines for all of my classes. Just look below this video. That is my speaking outline. Literally, I have it in front of me on a piece of paper right here. And I suggest you do the same, that your speaking outline be a hard copy, because then if you're experiencing mechanical difficulties, you could lose your speaking outline. And if you've spent enough time putting together your speech and practicing your speech, you won't even need to refer to your speaking outline, but it's there just in case. And we'll talk about different ways that you can construct outlines, but you can easily see my preferred mode of outlining, though what you need to do is to find your preferred mode of outlining, where less is more, keywords and ideas, and you can see that I just divide things up into major categories, and then what I do is I have subtopics underneath that. But more on speaking outlines in the next few classes. Practicing. And in fact, I encourage all of you to practice in front of family and friends, and you can certainly reach out to me. We could do a practice session on the phone or on Zoom if you would like to do so. Finally, delivering your speech. So what you're going to be doing is recording your speech, much like I record these classes, and then you will be uploading that onto Moodle. And I will be putting a special folder into Moodle for your speeches so that everybody can upload that on the date in which the speech is due. And then the following class is when your classmates will view that speech and send me feedback. I'll give you more information about that as we get a little bit closer. There's even a graphic on page 104, if you're using the newest version of the book, where it almost looks like a staircase. All of these pieces, beginning at the bottom of the staircase, selecting and narrowing the topic, which is where you are, to eventually working your way to the top of the staircase, which is delivering the speech. So, as you can see, I put most of the readings from the textbook up front because I thought this information would be useful to you when you are putting together your speech. And I want you to begin thinking about your speech, even though it isn't going to be due until for a little bit of time. And that said, what I am going to ask for your discussion forum question, which will be Thursday on the 23rd, is directly related to speech number 1. And my question to you is, what do you think will be your biggest challenge delivering speech number 1 and why? Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are encouraged to do so. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So I will leave you to contemplate what some of your challenges might be for speech number 1. If you did not have a chance to watch the Toastmasters video last class, please watch it now. And then we will continue on in the future on Thursday. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.